So, uh, so 30 years ago, in the spring of 1996, a successful but relatively obscure professor of physics at NYU published Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity in the cultural journal Social Text. He announced that the article was total nonsense. The New York Times ran a front page story covering it as an academic scandal and a first shot in the science wars. And the rest is history. So today, Alan Sokal is a professor of math at the University College of London. He's the author of Fashionable Nonsense in 1997, where he developed his broader critique of postmodernism and French theory, and a long list of other books and formal math papers, way too numerous to mention. Anyway, he didn't come here for praise of his accomplishments, however, but for some real conversations. And I really respect Alan Sokal for three major reasons. One, he was ahead of his time. He saw a whole set of problems that we're dealing with today in our universities. He's brave and provocative in saying what he thinks, and he's open to disagreements. And that's what we're going to do here tonight. So we've not come to celebrate Alan Sokal, and we're not going to be burying anybody. We'll come to disagree with him. And it's an event organized by Heterodox Community at McMaster. So Heterodox Academy is a group of academic insiders founded in 2015 as an American nonprofit by Jonathan Haidt and a group of other individual faculty members and administrators, and he's a social psychologist at NYU. And the goal is internal reform of our universities to have more open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement. And so there is a national version of Heterodox Academy in Canada, led by Andy Selwood, we owe a lot for making this event happen. He's also a physicist who works at Vancouver Community College, and he was essential for what we're doing. So part of what we're going to do here is we're going to model the heterodox way. So Alan's going to give a formal paper, and then we're going to be followed by four discussants, and they're going to get to questions. And we have lots of time as a group in the room and a group on in the live stream. And so I'm just going to introduce the four discussants and then give you a little bit of suggestions for how we can have the conversation. So Matteo Scarselli is a professor of mathematics at McMaster, former the chair of the department there. He studies mathematical finance and macroeconomics. He's originally from Brazil, and he studied in London. He had met Alan years ago, so there was a little bit of reunion here. He has some really interesting critiques of how mainstream economics deals with climate change and other issues, just the kind of heterodox academy academics, the kind of things that we promote. Although you could join us even if you're a mainstream economist and I just want more viewpoint diversity in our universities. So I'm a sociologist, so I like to, bash mainstream economists, but that's more my own lack of knowledge, and so just had to get that in there. But anyway, Matthias is currently the deputy provost at McMaster. I have to say I haven't really had much contact with him in his official role. I just know him as a professor and an intellectual who cares about ideas, and he's speaking in that capacity here, and I'm really looking forward to what he has to say. So Philippa Carter recently retired after spending 40 years at McMaster as a graduate student, or lecturer, and teaching professor in religious studies. So I met her on a picket line at McMaster, one of my favorite places to meet people. I've been at McMaster for 30 years, and I have not known a better undergraduate teacher than Dr. Carter. She's committed, engaged, knows every student's name, and lives viewpoint diversity and constructive disagreement. And so she's willing to argue with students when she thinks they're wrong, even about controversial issues. I know we're going to hear some of her feisty spirit tonight. So Dr. Leonard Waverman is recently retired professor of finance and business economics at McMaster. He's a former dean of the DeGroote Business School and one of the co-chairs of the Heterodox Academy community here at McMaster, along with Philip McGibbon, who's a chemistry professor. Thank you, Phil, for coming from Hamilton, and he's in the audience. And one thing I like about Len is he gave great advice about how to make the heterodox community welcoming to people from all political stripes. I'm a Harrington, Stephen Lewis socialist. I think probably Len's a little bit more on the center right of Canadian politics. Never comes up because we're not really talking about that. We're really focused on building a diverse academic community, isolated from the polarization we're seeing all around, and he has a principled commitment to both academic freedom and free speech. So I'm thrilled he could join us. And he just got in at 2:30 today on a plane. So there's commitment to Heterodox Academy that he could make it to this event. And then Dr. Jeffrey Donaldson is professor of English and Cultural Studies. He's a poet. He's interested in literature, poetics, and interdisciplinary spaces between science and the humanities. The title of the 2015 McGill-Queen's book, Missing Link, The Evolution of Metaphor and the Metaphor of Evolution. He's radically moderate. He has a delightful way with both words and people. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say about the scientists in the room. So after a bit, we'll have the panel. We'll have a little bit of back and forth after the talk, and then the panel. We're gonna have a little conversation. Then we'll open up to in person and the live stream. And so just a little suggestions for questions and discussion. The heterodox way is make your case with evidence, be intellectually charitable, be intellectually humble, be constructive, and be yourself. So be constructive, but say what you think. And so that's what we're going to do today. And Alan's not from Canada, so hopefully you don't get too much into the weeds about politics here. Or this issue or that issue on campus might not be the best use of our time. We have Alan Sokal here. Let's talk about things that he knows about. And remember, this is an intellectual space. It's not a political organizing event from any perspective. So hopefully, and I'm going to try and make it a special effort to get comments and questions from people outside the leadership of Heterodox Academy. Let's get some people who disagree maybe with Alan. We'll start off with that. Alan believes very strongly in that. So thank you very much for joining us. And so I just hope you'll join me in welcoming Alan Sokal to Canada and to McMaster on the 30th anniversary of the Sokal hoax.
Great. Thank you, Neil. So let me tell you the story. The first time I attended a humanities seminar, I think it was a friend of mine in the Spanish department at Duke University, and I was visiting her and then attended a seminar there. And the speaker sat down and started reading his published article, with all of the subordinate clauses, everything you would put in a published article. And I was appalled, right? That these supposed experts in language don't know the difference between written language and oral language. I mean, if a mathematician or physicist did that, they'd have eggs thrown at them, right? And well, now in my second career, guess what I've gotten to doing? Gotten to reading my talks. So please, physicists and mathematicians in the room, I hope you didn't bring eggs. Okay, so anyway, I hope that at least my written talk shows some difference of some appreciation of the difference between oral and written language. But anyway, so what I'm going to talk about tonight are some ideological threats to science, but I want to start by making some general and fairly traditional observations about the nature of the scientific enterprise. So science, and by that I include both the natural sciences and the social sciences, is, or at least is supposed to be, a truth-seeking enterprise. So the phenomena that one decides to study might be chosen for their conceptual significance, for their social and economic importance, or maybe simply out of personal curiosity. But whatever topic a scientist decides to investigate, she's intellectually and morally obliged to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even or especially if that evidence conflicts with her preconceptions or her desires. Now, science, of course, doesn't always work that way. I mean, scientists are human after all. But that, anyway, is the ideal towards which we strive. And if there's freedom of debate within the scientific community, so freedom to hold each other's ideas to stringent conceptual and empirical scrutiny, then the scientific community collectively is more likely to reach objectively true conclusions than any of us could do alone. Now, a scientist's political and social values may influence her selection of topics to study. That's perfectly legitimate. But those values should be carefully put to the side when evaluating the evidence. The goal of the scientific endeavor is to find out how things really are, not to confirm how we wish they were. Now, it's important to make the caveat that many decisions that we have to make collectively on anything from educational methods to pandemics to climate change, they have to be based on scientific knowledge. We need detailed factual evidence about how children learn to read, how viruses spread, how the Earth's oceans and atmospheres behave. But although this scientific information forms the essential background to public policy, it doesn't determine that policy, because policy decisions involve values and trade-offs between competing values. But whatever your values are, it still behooves you to have an understanding of reality that's as accurate as possible to inform your policy choices. Because if you don't, then you risk implementing policies that are counterproductive as assessed by your own values. And in a democracy, every citizen has the right and should have the opportunity to do the same. Now, one important social mechanism in science is peer review. So proposed scientific contributions are evaluated for their correctness and importance by experts in the field, ideally double-blind. And then depending on that evaluation, the article might be accepted for publication, accepted subject to revision, or rejected entirely. Now, that system is not perfect. It can be compromised by personal rivalries, competing research programs, and simple reviewer sloppiness. But it's the best that we've been able to, thus far, to devise. And the key desideratum is that submissions should be evaluated for their conceptual rigor, their methodological soundness, their empirical thoroughness, and their importance to the scientific field. Now, social and political values may play a role in this last aspect, telling us which topics are most important to investigate. But they should play no role in the evaluation of which contributions on that subject are fit to publish. That evaluation should be based solely on the scientific quality of the research, not on whether we find its results congenial. So this, anyway, has been the official policy of the scientific community for the past 3 centuries. Implemented imperfectly, to be sure, but nevertheless functioning as an important regulative ideal. But times have changed. Now, ideology threatens openly to corrupt the truth-seeking enterprise that we call science. And in this talk, I'd like to give some examples of how. So I'm going to focus tonight on threats to science coming from within the academic community, and indeed sometimes ironically from within the scientific community itself. These threats have been around for a decade or so. But since January 2025, we've had to contend with a second and vastly more dangerous threat to science, at least in the United States, coming from the administration of Donald Trump. So now we're seeing 2 simultaneous ideological attacks on scientific objectivity and academic freedom. One coming from the so-called left, and I put that in quotation marks because it doesn't have anything to do with the left that I belong to, using the power of social ostracism, and in some cases, the institutional power of universities over their employees and students. And then, on the other side, an attack from the hard right using the power of the state. Now, the fact that I'm going to talk tonight primarily about the first threat doesn't mean that I'm discounting the second. Quite the contrary. In my opinion, it's far more dangerous precisely because it uses the power of the state. But the second threat is better known. Many people have written eloquently about it, and I don't think I would have much to add, especially as I've lived outside the United States for the past 10 years. So my goal tonight is instead to give some details about the first threat over a variety of scientific disciplines. And I also think that the 2 threats are not unrelated. But that's a complex story that I hope we can discuss, we can address in the discussion period afterwards. And one other thing, though science in my definition includes both the natural and social sciences, in this talk I'm going to focus on examples concerning the natural sciences, but just because of the limits of my competence. Okay, so before I talk about present-day debates, I think it might be useful to step back 30 years into the past, which Neil already did. I mean, I know, in Neil's introduction, I'm afraid, unfortunately, I know what my obituary is going to say. There's no way I can get out of that, no matter what theorems I may prove in the future. Neil gave my obituary. But anyway, so before I talk about present day debates, let's step back 30 years in the past and recall some now ancient history. So in the mid 1990s, there were the so-called science wars. To my mind, that's an unfortunate military metaphor applied to what is, after all, an intellectual debate. But anyway, those science wars pitted two contrasting points of view about the nature of scientific knowledge. So for brevity, let me oversimplify a little bit and say simply that on one side, a motley crew of postmodernist influenced literary scholars and social scientists, often, but not always, of a leftist and feminist political bent, espoused an extreme social constructivist view of science and scientific knowledge. And I can provide some precise quotations from their writings in case you worry that I'm exaggerating. The examples are even worse than what I've just said. On the other side, there was another motley crew of scientists and philosophers, plus some humanities scholars, historians, and social scientists from across the political spectrum from left to right, who defended traditional notions of rationality and objectivity, at least as ideals towards which to strive. Now, it's true that some leftist scientists, such as Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould, did advocate social constructivist theses with regard to particular and highly controversial items of scientific study, notably human intelligence. And some feminist scientists, such as Ruth Hubbard and Evelyn Fox Keller, did the same with regard to other corners of biology and psychology. But no prominent scientists, as far as I know, endorsed the radical view advocated by some sociologists and literary scholars that all purported scientific knowledge, from neutrino physics to organometallic chemistry to lepidopterology, which I believe is the study of butterflies, is deeply imbued with social ideology. And no notable scientists, as far as I know, advocated social constructivism with respect to long-established and uncontroversial aspects of scientific knowledge, such as the atomic theory of matter or the double helix structure of DNA. That, alas, has changed, at least on certain subjects, and maybe you can guess which ones. But before I talk about those subjects, I want to go back even further to one classic of that earlier era, which was the sociologist Andrew Pickering's book, Constructing Quarks, which was ominously written in 1984. That book provided a superb and extraordinarily detailed history of modern elementary particle physics. Really good. Sandwiched between initial and final chapters of, and now let me be blunt about my view, astonishingly poor philosophy. And on the basis of that philosophy, Pickering concluded that, I quote, "There is no obligation upon anyone framing a view of the world to take account of what 20th century science has to say. Worldviews are cultural products. There is no need to be intimidated by them." Now, dare I say that this is grossly misguided. Of course, our ideas about quarks are human and historical and social construction. I mean, that's a truism. But there's good reason to believe that the quarks themselves have existed ever since the Big Bang, roughly 13.7 billion years ago. But the reasons justifying that belief are subtle. I mean, quarks are not, after all, directly observable. Well, neither are dinosaurs, for that matter. All we can observe are their fossils. But dinosaurs, at least, are or were mid-sized macroscopic objects, and we can easily imagine what they looked and behaved like by analogy with contemporary animals that we can observe today. So we certainly have good reason to believe that there existed at some time in the past, roughly 240 to 65 million years ago, the animals that we call dinosaurs. And we know some things about how they behave. We don't know what color their skin was, because we don't see their skin. We only have the fossils of their bones. So that we're just guessing. But we know a fair amount about dinosaurs. Now, subatomic particles like quarks, by contrast, are very far from our everyday experience, and their behavior is extraordinarily strange. Quantum mechanics was invented by Schrödinger and Heisenberg in 1925. So last year was the centenary. But no one today, I think, really understands what quantum mechanics is telling us about the fundamental nature of the universe. And let me put this in the first person. I've been studying quantum mechanics for a little bit more than half of that century. And the more I learn about it, the less I understand. And yet, quantum mechanics can predict the magnetic moment of the electron to 11 decimal places accuracy. So that, as Richard Feynman put it, that's equivalent to measuring the distance from Los Angeles to New York to within the width of a human hair. That is an incredible accuracy. Obviously, quantum electrodynamics is telling us something true about the universe, but we don't really understand what. Now, quarks are actually more subtle than electrons. Electrons are too small to be directly seen, but at least we can observe their tracks in bubble chambers. But our best contemporary theories tell us that free quarks can't exist. Quarks are always bound inside other elementary particles like protons and neutrons. Their existence and behavior has to be inferred by a complicated chain of reasoning that involves both theory and experiment. Now, the general outlines of that reasoning can be explained to the lay reader. There are some good, popularizations written by physicists, but the details require advanced mathematics and a deep knowledge of physics. But even at the general level, it's definitely very subtle. Okay, now, fast forward 4 decades. The entire American medical establishment, from the American Medical Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics to the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association, insists that sex, by which I mean male or female, not copulation, is, in the AAP's words, an assignment that is made at birth. And so there are the American Medical Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics. And I ask, what on earth could this possibly mean? I mean, the facts about sex are pretty straightforward, much more straightforward than facts about quarks. And they're taught in any half-decent high school course in biology. Nearly all animals, as well as many plants, reproduce sexually. In almost all sexually reproducing multicellular species, this occurs by combining a large gamete, called an ovum or egg, with a small gamete called a sperm. Now, some hermaphrodite plants and animals produce ova and sperm, but there are no hermaphrodite mammalian species. In mammals, each individual produces only one kind of gamete. Those individuals that produce relatively few ova are called female. Those that produce large numbers of sperm are called male. Whether a mammal embryo develops into a male or a female is determined, at least when things go right, which is nearly all the time, by a pair of sex chromosomes, XX for females and XY for males. So in short, sex in all animals is defined by gamete size. Sex in all mammals is determined by sex chromosomes. And there are 2 and only 2 sexes, female and male, because there are 2 and only 2 types of gametes, ova and sperm. Now, for sure, quirks of mutation or prenatal development may leave some individuals unable to produce viable gametes at all, but an infertile individual with a Y chromosome is still male, just like a one-legged person is still a full member of our bipedal species. Now, much is speciously made of the fact that a very few humans are born with chromosomal patterns other than XX and XY. That's true. The most common, Klinefelter syndrome, which is XXY, occurs in about 0.1% of live births, so 1 in 1,000. These individuals are anatomically male, though sometimes infertile. Some extremely rare conditions like de la Chapelle syndrome, which is 30 cases per million live births, and Swyer syndrome, which is 5 cases per million, arguably fall outside the standard male-female classification. But even so, the sexual divide is an exceedingly clear binary as any distinction that you can find in biology. So where does this leave the medical association's claims about sex assigned at birth? I mean, a baby's name is assigned at birth. Nobody doubts that. But a baby's sex is not assigned. It's determined at conception and then observed at birth, first by examination of the external genital organs, and then in cases of doubt by chromosomal analysis. And now here's an interesting remark. So my UCL colleague, Alice Sullivan, who's a quantitative sociologist, drew my attention to some very interesting data showing the sex ratio at birth in various countries since 1950. And in several countries, you see, mostly in Asia and Central Asia, so the most extreme case was China, there's been, starting around 1980, a huge preponderance of boys over girls, which reached a peak ratio of 118 to 100 in China in 2005. Now it's dropped to 111. This huge disparity is going to be a huge social problem for China when 90 of those girls marry 90 of those boys, and then you have 28 men chasing 10 women. That's going to be a big social problem. Anyway, but what's the cause of this disparity? The obvious cause is the cultural preference for boys combined with the availability of sex-selective abortion. And sex-selective abortion is possible precisely because sex is determined at conception and is observable in utero well before it can be assigned at birth. And indeed, aborted fetuses, which are never born, also have a sex, in some countries preferentially female. Now, of course, just because sex is observed at birth doesn't mean that that observation is always correct. Any observation can be erroneous. That's a fundamental principle of science. And in very rare cases, the sex reported on the birth certificate is inaccurate and needs to be subsequently corrected. But the fallibility of observation doesn't change the fact that what's being observed, a person's sex, is an objective biological reality, just like their blood group or fingerprint pattern, not something that's assigned. The medical association's pronouncements are social constructivism gone amok, this time about a subject that has been more or less accurately understood by humans, maybe not with all the scientific details, but that's been accurately understood by humans ever since the beginning of our species. Sex is not like quarks. So let's go back to the Medical Association's dogma. What could possibly have impelled sober-minded scientists to advocate such a bizarre and easily refutable view? And the cause is evidently political. The medical establishment's newfound reluctance to speak honestly about biological reality and its insouciance in speaking dishonestly about it presumably stems from a laudable desire to defend the human rights of transgender people. But while the goal is praiseworthy, the chosen method is misguided. Protecting transgender people from discrimination and harassment does not require pretending that sex is merely assigned. And so the bottom line is this: it's never justified to distort the facts in the service of a social or political cause, no matter how just. If the cause is truly just, then it can be defended in full acceptance of the facts about the real world. And if that cannot be done, then the cause is not just. And when an organization that proclaims itself scientific distorts the scientific facts in the service of a social cause, it undermines not only its own credibility, but that of science generally. How can the public be expected to trust the medical establishment's declarations on other controversial issues, such as vaccines, issues on which the medical consensus is indeed right, when it has so visibly and blatantly misstated the facts about something so simple as sex? Okay, well, one might respond to this by observing that medicine is not, strictly speaking, a science. It's an applied field that combines biological science with psychological and social notions of highly variable rigor. And it's from this latter side that politics has entered and has taken precedence over truth. So it's fair to ask, are there any other examples of similar politicization corrupting physics, chemistry, or biology? Well, in Galileo's times, physics and astronomy were the subjects of political and theological dispute. But for the past 2 centuries, it's principally biology that's been on the firing line. For a long time, religious conservatives were loath to accept the fact that biological species, including humans, have evolved over time, much less to accept Darwin's materialist explanation of that evolution by natural and sexual selection. And those anti-evolution views continue to be strong in the USA, as well as in some parts of the Muslim world, and the resulting political pressure distorts the teaching of biology in the public schools. But the effect on research and teaching in the universities is minimal. Nowadays, the pressure on research and university-level teaching in biology comes principally from the so-called left. And until recently, it concerned mainly the investigation of statistical differences in human traits, especially psychological traits, by sex or geographical ancestry. Of course, the geographical ancestry is the precise term for what people usually call race. But nowadays, even mentioning sex as a biological fact can elicit a Twitter storm of condemnation. And the main victims, not surprisingly, are researchers with untenured precarious contracts. So, there were cancellation campaigns against superstars like Richard Dawkins and Steven Pinker, but they're too big to be canceled. The campaigns against them are intended as a warning to others. If Steven Pinker can be attacked, you, the graduate student, you, the untenured assistant professor, you could be next. So let me give you 2 examples of that. Carol Hooven is a biologist at Harvard, much praised. I mean, she won teaching awards and all sorts of stuff, but untenured. She was in the Human Evolutionary Biology Department. She was author of an acclaimed book on testosterone. There you go. She got herself into hot water when she dared to say on national television, now I have to say, it was on Fox News that she said it, because it was Fox News that invited her to talk about her book. CNN didn't invite her. Fox News invited her to talk about her book. And here's what she said. She said, now this is really radical what she said. The facts are that there are 2 sexes, male and female, and those sexes are designated by the kinds of gametes we produce. And then she stressed, we can treat people with respect and respect their gender identities and use their preferred pronouns. So understanding the facts about biology doesn't prevent us from treating people with respect. So she used the word respect 3 times in one sentence. That didn't stop the graduate student director of her department's Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Task Force from lambasting her remarks, on Twitter, of course, as transphobic and harmful. Well, to make a long story short, Harvard's administrators failed to defend Hooven's reputation or even her academic freedom. They, issued the usual weaselly 2-sided statements. And 18 months later, she resigned. I mean, what happened actually was the graduates, so she had this course that students were clamoring to get into. After she dared to say on national television that there were 2 sexes, the graduate students in her department refused to be TAs in her course. And she couldn't teach a course with, 300 or 500 students with no TAs. And basically, she gave up and resigned. And well, now Steven Pinker found her a position in his lab, but she's not teaching. A similar fate befell the Penn State biologist Colin Wright. So he was a postdoc at the time. He dared to author an article arguing that the observed statistical sex differences in human behavior are probably at least in part grounded in evolution, and that even more shockingly, it seems, there are 2 sexes, male and female, and over 99.98% of human beings belong unambiguously to one or the other. And then to make matters worse, Wright later co-authored an essay, a brilliant essay, if you ask me, entitled, No One is Born in the Wrong Body. I think it's a brilliant essay and basically a feminist essay, right? Shortly thereafter, and this was at the height of the academic recruitment season when he was a postdoc looking for an assistant professor job, Someone posted a listing on the major job board for ecology and evolution, which is his field. Colin Wright is a transphobe who supports race science. And the activists, they're possibly a very small but loud group, were explicit in their attempts to intimidate any university that would be foolhardy enough to offer Wright a job. And 2 months later, he quit academia, and he recounted the details of the story in an article that he shrewdly titled, "Think Cancel Culture Doesn't Exist? My Own Lived Experience Says Otherwise." Yeah. But, you know, Hooven and White themselves are at pains to emphasize that the harm arising from this politicization of scientific inquiry is not just, or even primarily, the manifest injustice that's done to researchers like themselves. Rather, the principal harm is done to the scientific endeavor itself. By inducing researchers to self-censor as a matter of personal and professional preservation, cancel culture undermines the freedom of debate that's the cornerstone of the scientific community's claims to knowledge. And this is something that John Stuart Mill pointed out a century and a half ago. He was using the example of Newtonian mechanics, and I'll come back to this later. To quote from him, "The beliefs which we have most warrant for have no safeguard to rest on, but a standing invitation to the whole world to prove them unfounded. If the challenge is not accepted, or is accepted and the attempt fails, we are far enough from certainty still, but we've done the best that the existing state of human reason admits of. This is the amount of certainty attainable by a fallible being, and this the sole way of attaining it." So when that freedom of debate is curtailed, even true ideas stop being rationally justified. So I'll come back to that at the end. Now, in the physical sciences, by contrast with the biological sciences, the main attacks on the freedom of research have come from right-wing politicians attacking climate science and environmental science and attempting to defund them. For a while, this threat receded as conservative politicians mostly retreated from questioning anthropogenic global warming and focused instead on the allegedly excessive cost of transition to a non-carbon economy. But it's resurged again under Donald Trump. So this is a serious danger. There's also some pressure on the physical sciences and mathematics from the so-called woke left. But at present, it's mainly concerned not with the content of research, but with vague calls for the decolonization of curricula and for decentering whiteness and cis-heteropatriarchy in pedagogy. Now, it's tolerably clear what decolonization could mean in history and literature, but it's less clear what it might mean in the natural sciences and mathematics, which, after all, purport to produce, and in my view, do often produce, universally valid knowledge. But some advocates of decolonization, not all, but some, take the radical position that scientific and mathematical knowledge is not, in fact, universally valid. And in New Zealand, this postmodernist idea has now become official policy. The national curriculum explicitly mandates, quote, equal status for Maturanga Maori, which means Maori knowledge, asserting that it has, again, quote, equal value with other bodies of knowledge, presumably including modern science. And indeed, the chemistry curriculum for New Zealand high schools was revised to include the concept of Maori, which is defined as the binding force between the physical and the spiritual. And students are taught that Maori is present in all matter. One chemist perceptively commented, "Who discovered this binding force between the physical and the spiritual? And what evidence was involved in its discovery? If this binding force is real, then everyone needs to know about it. It needs to be in the chemistry syllabus of every country, not just New Zealand." It actually appears now that the inclusion of Maori in the chemistry curriculum was quietly rolled back after protests from scientists, but it took some work. Okay. Other advocates of decolonization do accept the universality of scientific knowledge, but simply urge greater attention in teaching to the non-Western origins of much mathematics and science. And that's a very sensible suggestion. So, for example, every mathematician knows that the concept of zero as a number arose in India in the 5th century CE, and that algebra was developed by Islamic scholars starting around 800 CE before being elaborated in Renaissance Europe. So we mathematicians know that. Students deserve to know that too. But the main focus of science and mathematics teaching has to be on our subject, after all. That's where we lecturers can rightly claim some expertise, not on its history, because as far as history, most of us are just rank amateurs. Students who want to pursue the history of science should learn it from professional historians of science, learning how to think like historians and how to critique theories such as decoloniality rather than simply accepting them as fact, as one critic put it. And then one final aspect of decolonization is the proposal to rename the contributions of scientists whose behavior is now considered to be morally lacking, or whose extra scientific ideas are now considered to be offensive. So, for example, Isaac Newton allegedly benefited from colonialism. Fritz Haber developed chemical weapons. William Shockley, racism and eugenics, and so on. And the chemist Anna Krylov wrote an eloquent article, The Peril of Politicizing Science, where she looked at the downsides of these cancellations done in the name of maintaining moral purity, which in earlier epochs targeted Marie Curie. She had an affair with a married man, and Alan Turing, who was gay. And finally, what about this decentering whiteness and cis heteropatriarchy in teaching? So there was an article on dismantling whiteness in physics teaching that was published a few years ago in the journal Physical Review, Physics Education Research. So that's the section of the prestigious Physical Review, the main American physics journal, devoted to experimental and theoretical research relating to the teaching and learning of physics and astronomy. So I won't enter into the details of this article. You can read it for yourself. It was criticized a lot after it appeared. Some of the criticism was intemperate, and the editors intervened and said, look, we don't want ad hominem attacks. We don't want insults. We want constructive criticism. And they invited people to contribute constructive and respectful criticism in the form of comments. So 4 authors submitted a comment, and the comment was rejected by the journal's editor on the grounds that it was, quote, framed from the perspective of a research paradigm that is different from the one of the research being critiqued. And so the authors, so as the authors dryly but accurately pointed out, they said, this is akin to stating that an astronomer must first accept astrology as true before critiquing it. So anyway, you can read their article. It's on the archive. And they did eventually publish it in some European journal of politics, but it was not published in the Physical Review, Physics Education Research. Okay. I'd like to give one more example of politicization from arising within the scientific community that I think should raise great concern. 2 years ago, the prestigious journal Nature issued a new ethics guidance concerning proposed submissions. But the guidance isn't about the protection of human research subjects. That's been strictly regulated for many decades. Nor is it about restricting the publication of information that poses serious material dangers, like facilitating the production of nuclear or biological weapons. Rather, the guidance purports to address other forms of harm that could be caused by a scientific publication. And on these grounds, the editors arrogate to themselves an astonishingly broad power. So let me quote. Regardless of content type, research, review, or opinion, And for research, regardless of whether a research project was reviewed and approved by an appropriate institutional ethics committee, editors reserve the right to request modifications to, or correct or otherwise amend post-publication, and in severe cases, refuse publication of, or retract post-publication. So this, of course, was all written by lawyers, right? So this is the lawyer stuff. Now let's get to the meat of what they propose to censor. Content that undermines or could reasonably be perceived to undermine the rights and dignities of an individual human group on the basis of socially constructed or socially relevant human groupings. Now, that vague and subjective language is an open door to ideological censorship of valid scientific contributions, a censorship that the editors don't even attempt to disguise. So I'd like to evaluate critically the justifications that they've offered in support of this brave new policy. Now, they start ominously. They say, although academic freedom is fundamental, it is not unbounded. Now, vague assertions of that kind are always a bad sign. You know what's coming next. The guidance purports to apply ethical principles analogous to those used to protect human research subjects, but now concerning other types of harms. And I quote again, for example, research may, inadvertently, stigmatize individuals or human groups. It may be discriminatory, racist, sexist, ableist, or homophobic. It may provide justification for undermining the human rights of specific groups simply because of their social characteristics. So I'd like to slowly unpack these claims. So first of all, what could it mean for scientific research to stigmatize individuals or human groups and to do so inadvertently? So suppose research finds that obesity can cause cancer. Well, it can. Does that stigmatize overweight people? Well, some people would argue that it does, but that's shooting the messenger because we don't like the message. In fact, suppressing this research would do harm overall, above all, to overweight people by denying them information that they could use if they wish, and only if they wish, to protect their health. Or suppose that research finds that gay men have more sexual partners on average than heterosexual men. Well, they do. Does that stigmatize gay men? Well, maybe it does, at least in the eyes of people who disdain sexual promiscuity. But it's also important information in planning interventions to reduce the risk of sexually transmitted disease, interventions that would disproportionately benefit gay men. So the editors of Nature have assigned to themselves the purely subjective task of judging which scientific research stigmatizes some social group, and then they empower themselves to suppress valid scientific contributions, that is, information that's likely to be true and important on that sole basis. Okay, secondly, what could it mean for scientific research to be discriminatory, racist, sexist, ableist, or homophobic? Well, if the research incorporated racist or sexist presuppositions, then that would be an epistemic defect that would undermine the quality of the research and maybe invalidate it entirely, based purely on traditional scientific criteria. You don't need a new ethics guidance for that. Clearly, what the editors are getting at is not racist or sexist presuppositions, but rather conclusions from the research that the editors, in their infinite wisdom, judge to be racist or sexist. But that, again, is shooting the messenger. So let me give you another example. Suppose that research finds, and it seems that this is true, that men show larger variation than women over a range of cognitive and psychological traits, including various aspects of human intelligence, so that men are overrepresented at both the low and high ends of the scale, even when the means are equal. Now, surely this is not the only reason why women are underrepresented among scientists. Sexist stereotypes influencing girls and young women must also be a major contributing factor. And there are undoubtedly many other factors as well. But it might form part of the explanation. It might mean that even in a future non-sexist society, 60% of mathematicians will be men. And also, for that matter, a majority of people with intellectual disabilities will be men. Should this information be suppressed? Well, if that happens, then our ignorance of relevant facts will interfere with our ability to determine accurately the extent to which sexist discrimination does persist in various fields. And will also impede us from distinguishing between ameliorative policies that are effective from those that are not effective. And finally, what could it mean to provide justification for undermining the human rights of specific groups? So consider again the research about sex differences in the variation of mathematical ability. Would this research provide a justification for discriminating against women scientists? Absolutely not. It might provide a lame excuse for such discrimination, but not a justification. Every individual's work can be evaluated on its own merits. So the statistical properties of the groups to which that individual belongs are completely irrelevant. So what the editors seem to have in mind is not research that could justify undermining the human rights of specific groups. And anyway, it's hard to see how any scientific research could do that, simply because one cannot derive an ought from an is, but rather research that some people might attempt to misuse as a supposed justification for undermining human rights. But valid ideas shouldn't be suppressed because some people might misuse them. Rather, it's the misuse that should be criticized instead. So the bottom line is that the editors of Nature have arrogated to themselves the right to suppress valid scientific work that's both correct and important, purely because it allegedly undermines or could reasonably be perceived to undermine the rights and dignities of an individual or human group. But then the editors cover their tracks by introducing, in astute, lawyerly-like fashion, a new element. The scientific work need not actually undermine anybody's rights or dignities. It suffices that some unnamed people, and note the editor's strategic use of the passive voice, could reasonably be perceived to undermine. Some unnamed people could reasonably perceive the work to undermine someone's rights or dignities. But this is an extraordinarily broad criterion. It's likely that any controversial scientific work that has public policy implications will cause some people to perceive it as undermining someone's rights or dignities. So, for example, this is a real-life example. Consider an article reviewing the neuropsychological effects of puberty blockers. It will be labeled by advocates of gender identity ideology as undermining the rights and dignities of transgender people. And indeed, one of the anonymous peer reviewers of a journal that rejected this article rejected it, among other things, on the grounds that it was stigmatizing an already stigmatized group. So this article was rejected by 3 journals before a 4th journal finally accepted it. But then other people will reply, this research helps to protect the rights of gender norm nonconforming teenagers by offering them accurate information about the benefits and risks of proposed medical interventions. Now, admittedly, the editors require that the research slated for suppression could reasonably be perceived to undermine the rights and dignities of an individual or group. But who gets to decide which perceptions are reasonable and which are not? The editors themselves, of course. And these are the same editors who insist, among other things, that sex as defined by gametes and chromosomes, that is the well-established biological understanding, quote, has no foundation in science. That, quote, sex is more complex than male and female, and that the now outdated, according to them, biological view, quote, would undermine efforts to reduce discrimination against transgender people and those who do not fall into the binary categories of male or female. So consequently, any scientific article that employs the standard biological concept of sex now risks being characterized by the Nature editors as undermining the rights and dignities of transgender people, and ipso facto as being reasonably perceived to do that. Now, since that criterion would exclude a large chunk of work in biology and medicine, the editors can't apply it consistently without sabotaging their own journal. So they'll of necessity apply it selectively to suppress those studies whose conclusions they dislike. And the psychologist Bo Weingard perceptively pointed out, and I should say, Bo Weingard is a very controversial person, and I don't agree with a lot of things that he says, but the fact that you favorably cite author A on issue X implies nothing whatsoever about whether you endorse them on issue Y, Z, or W. But anyway, he perceptively pointed out, imagine for a moment that this editorial were written not by political progressives, but by conservative Catholics, who announced that any research promoting, even inadvertently, promiscuous sex, the breakdown of the nuclear family, agnosticism and atheism, or the decline of the nation state, that this would be suppressed or rejected, lest it inflict unspecified harm on vaguely defined groups or individuals. Many of those presently nodding along with Nature's editors would have no difficulty identifying the subordination of science to a political agenda if it were done that way. Now, the Nature editors attempt to soften the blow of their brazen announcement of future censorship by declaring that, quote, there is a fine balance between academic freedom and the protection of the dignity and rights of individuals and human groups. We commit to using this guidance cautiously and judiciously, consulting with ethics experts and advocacy groups where needed. And Weinberg comments, this is not at all reassuring. Asking ethicists to assess the wisdom of publishing a scientific journal article is as antithetical to the spirit of science as soliciting publication advice from a religious scholar. Who are these ethics experts and advocacy groups anyway? Imagine the outcry on the left if a journal announced it would be consulting pro-life advocates before publishing an article about the effects of abortion on well-being. Or if it decided to consult conservative evangelicals when evaluating an article about the effects of adoption by homosexual couples. Okay, so there's one further danger that the advocates of ideological censorship in science, I think, would do well to ponder. And this is where I want to go back to John Stuart Mill. And he observed long ago, quote, the peculiar evil of science silencing the suppression of the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion, still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they're deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what's almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. Now, the first side of this bifurcation, I think, is clear. We all naturally think that our current opinions are correct. Otherwise, they wouldn't be our opinions. But we still ought to be willing to admit that we're not infallible, well, except for those of us who are popes of the Roman Catholic Church. And that means if you really care about truth, you ought to be open to hearing arguments against your current opinions and open to changing those opinions whenever the counter-arguments turn out to be cogent. Now, maybe the Nature editors are so utterly certain that their views on a huge variety of disparate subjects are all 100% correct, that they're unable to imagine learning even a tiny bit from listening to reasoned criticisms. And if that's the case, then they themselves are the losers, as are, unfortunately, their readers who are prevented from hearing relevant evidence. But the other side of Mill's bifurcation is less obvious, so let me quote Mill again. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. Nor is it enough that he should hear the arguments of adversaries from his own teachers, presented as they state them and accompanied by what they offer as refutations. That's not the way to do justice to the arguments or bring them into real contact with his own mind. He must be able to hear them from the persons who actually believe them, who defend them in earnest and do their very utmost for them. He must know them in their most plausible and persuasive form. 99 in 100 of what are called educated men are in this condition, even of those who can argue fluently for their opinions. Their conclusion may be true, but it might be false for anything they know. They have never thrown themselves into the mental position of those who think differently from them and considered what such persons may have to say. And consequently, they do not, in any proper sense of the word, know the doctrine which they themselves profess. And Mill's two-pronged argument in favor of the freedom of debate is, in fact, a crucial ingredient in legitimizing knowledge in general and scientific knowledge in particular. And it's striking that, as I mentioned earlier, Mill used an example from science, namely Newtonian mechanics, to explain why. So Isaac Newton published his celebrated laws of motion in 1687. And by the time Mill was writing in 1859, scientists had accumulated overwhelming evidence from both terrestrial and astronomical observations that Newtonian physics is correct, even to the point of predicting accurately in 1846 the existence and precise location of the hitherto unknown planet Neptune. It was discovered because the orbit of Uranus didn't quite agree with what Newtonian mechanics predicted, using the known positions of the known 6 planets. And Leverrier in France and Adams in England guessed, oh, maybe there's an unseen planet doing the perturbation. They both computed where that planet would have to be and how massive it would have to be to cause the observed perturbations. And they both wrote to astronomer friends, look there. One astronomer immediately looked there and found Neptune. The other dawdled for 6 weeks and then found Neptune. I can't remember which was which, but Leverrier and Adams both deserve credit. But Mill points out, imagine that at some point the government, or even just the scientific societies, had decided that, in view of the overwhelming evidence of the correctness of Newtonian mechanics, it would henceforth be forbidden to dispute it. If that were true, then we would now have much less reason to believe in the correctness of Newtonian mechanics. It's precisely the fact that Newtonian mechanics has held up in the face of free and open debate that gives us such justified belief in its correctness. And then, of course, there's an added twist to the story that illustrates the first side of Mill's argument, which unfortunately Mill didn't live to see. It turns out that Newtonian mechanics is not exactly correct. It's an extremely accurate approximation in many circumstances, but it's not exactly correct. And this was discovered in 1905 by Albert Einstein, more than 30 years after Mill's death. But this important fact might never have been discovered, or at the very least, its discovery would have been delayed if criticism of Newton's theory had been forbidden. So both sides of Mill's argument are important. So what does that mean for today? Even if the progressives, in quotation marks, are 100% correct on every subject and have nothing whatsoever to learn from their thoughtful critics, censorship of opposing views is still harmful to their own cause because it undermines the good reasons for anybody else to adopt their ideas. So I think it would be a real positive step if the Nature editors were to reflect on this argument, which after all is Mill's, not mine, and respond to it. But unfortunately, people with power are not accustomed to acknowledging, much less addressing, reasoned critiques from lesser mortals, so don't hold your breath. Anyway, I think I've gone on for much too long, so I want to thank you for your patience in sitting through this diatribe and open the floor to all the comments and criticisms that you'd like to throw at me. First you four, and then all of you. And now I can take my seat at the far left. Or as the audience may say, the far right. I think I should get a paper and take notes so that I miss you.
So this is extremely uncomfortable because now I'm on the far right. And but anyways, not theirs. That's right. Yeah. So Alan was saying before that he would like there's not to be four people praising his presentation and his work. I think I'm the one that is most likely to just do that because we are cut from the same cloth, so to speak, and work in similar fields. And also I read Fashionable Nonsense, the book that he published with Jean Bricmont shortly after the hoax about 30 years ago. So that was part of my upbringing academically. So not too much to disagree with Alan, but I'll try to take different angles and maybe ask him a few questions and then disagree on a few things. So when I start from the beginning of your talk as threats to science, I remember just after the hoax, I think you famously gave an interview where you said, this is not to protect science. We are fine, thank you very much. It's to protect the left. And the left is in trouble if it doesn't have the level of intellectual rigor that it's demonstrating. Fast forward 30 years, I think the left continues to be in trouble. And I think that, the election of Donald Trump and the rise of populism around the world exemplifies that what some call woke speech is not doing that well for the left. There are deeper analysis of that, for example, by French economist Thomas Piketty. He called it the Brahmin left as an type of intellectual left that abandoned the working class and just puts itself in opposition to the merchant right and then leaves the working class kind of orphan of political parties and political affiliation. So I guess there's no question that threat was real and cause damages. But now you're talking about a threat to science. So I think you are revisiting the position that, thank you, we are fine, thank you very much. And so I just wanted to ask by how much you think science is threatened. And you gave some examples, but I wanted to kind of expand. So see, like, how, so from a risk analysis, I'm a financial mathematician now. So how much would you quantify the risk to science? Is it on the fringes? Is it something that goes to the core? So that was just one point. Do you want me to go through everything else? So okay. Yeah.
The answer is I honestly don't know, right? I'm not a biologist, for example, so I'm not in the thick of those debates. I don't know how much internal cancellation, so to speak, is going on. But my impression is that there is a problem there. In physics and chemistry, probably less so. But the biologists, at least the biologists who deal with this issue of sex, are really on the firing line.
Okay. So my second point is going all the way to the end of your talk and Stuart Mill and it was really an argument for freedom of debate, as you said, and free speech, and the fact that that's why we protect free speech, because it ultimately enhances society and so on. When Nadine Strossen was here at a Heterodox Academy event, she gave people a copy of her book. I took it home, I read her book, and she repeatedly makes the point that, mistakenly, nowadays, people think that protection of free speech is a right-wing cause, but historically, the people that suffer the most when government takes away the right for free speech are the weak, the minorities, the disempowered. And you also gave examples that if when this happens in science, the people that then get disadvantaged by scientific knowledge being censored are also the weak and minorities and disempowered. So I wanted to know if you think that there's a strong correlation with that, and if there are, like, if again the examples generalize, right? You're not just cherry pick, and you think that, you know, as the argument seems to be from history, that the vast majority of violations of free speech end up causing harm to the people who are not in power, if that is also the case with scientific speech.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the two things are analogous and not identical, right? So you would have to. Sorry. The two things are analogous but not identical. You would have to use different types of evidence to substantiate the two. But I think, I mean, in science, well, in academia, I think it's clear, right? Tenure mostly protects you. Yeah. Not entirely, as Francis Whittison can say, but tenure mostly protects people. Untenured people are at great risk, right? And as I said, the cancellation attempts against people like Steven Pinker and Richard Dawkins are not just, you know, firing. It's not just hopeless trying to cancel somebody who can't be canceled. It's clearly intended to make a warning to the people who are at most danger. And there's an eloquent article by a graduate student, I forget his name, Sean Comack, I think is the name. I've cited it in some of my own articles, who makes this point about the cancellation attempts against Steven Pinker. He says, the real target is you, the graduate student, the untenured assistant professor. Yeah. That's clear because of the way power works in the university.
Yeah. So moving on, my next point, and it will be just one before the last, is the title of your talk is Science and Ideology, and the problem with ideology is that it's a team sport, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like an us versus them, and it's and it conflates different issues into just like being on a line with one side and a line with another side, and it makes almost impossible to hold multi-layered positions that people at first might think are contradictory, but in fact, they are perfectly consistent. For example, that you might think, to talk about current events, that the Iranian regime is an appalling authoritarian regime, while at the same time, the attack by the American government is not justified. That, Hamas had committed atrocities against Israel, while at the same time thinking that the response from Israel was genocide. That sex is binary and not a sign at birth, while at the same time being a passionate defender of transgender rights. That not all knowledge has equal status, and scientific knowledge has a privileged status on the domains that science studies, while at the same time thinking that there is value in indigenous knowledge that can indeed be used within science. So all of those positions in particular I hold, and I think I can consistently defend them, but it's very difficult to then pick a side within the ideology that will then put me in a tribe, and the problem is that then without a tribe you are again unprotected and subject to multiple attacks. So it's not too much a question; it's just an observation that this is a
yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
And then my last point, if I can, it's just my one disagreement that you said that the best. You did say the best that we have so far, but for scientific publishing is the peer review double-blind system. I happen to disagree. I think so. I'm now an editor-in-chief of a journal, so I have seen, like, from the inside how things work, and have had many examples as an author, as a reviewer, and then as an editor of abuses of the double-blind peer review system. And in fact, what me and then other people that have been studying this issue are proposing is actually the complete opposite, a double-sided peer review, where the reviewer knows who wrote and everybody knows who is reviewing. The reviewer needs to stand by what they the reasons for accepting or rejecting the paper, and that's all out in the open, and it becomes a conversation that evolves, which then ultimately advances knowledge. And there are journals that are doing that. I published a paper in one, Earth Science Dynamics, and been very happy with the processes. But that's it.
I just want to say that's a good point, and I'm willing to. I think I should change that and say, you know, that this is an open question, trying to figure out what are better ways of doing science.
Oh, thank you so much. That's fantastic. Philippa?
Yes, thank you, and thank you so much for your thank you for your paper. It is on. You did. It is on. It's on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if I hear it though.
It's mostly for the recording and the, but maybe did you hear mine? Oh,
Yeah.
maybe that was just not working. So
Yes. I feel like I'm at a press conference. So yes, I appreciate it, but what I want, and I know Neil doesn't want us to just, but I have to tell you that when Transgressing Boundaries came out in 1996, I had just completed my graduate work. I was teaching at McMaster as a part-time instructor, and I thought this was just the greatest thing since sliced bread. It really, I didn't understand really the jokes because I wasn't knowledgeable enough about what you were the examples you were using. But just the whole idea that someone had called out the pomos in the way that you did, I was just fascinated, and it influenced me over the last 30 years in my teaching and so on. So that's enough. Thank you very much. But I will tell you one thing that really disturbed me about it, my experience encountering that and then talking to, senior colleagues and tenured people in my department, was that they seemed to be completely indifferent. This is another very clear memory I have of that. Now, this is religious studies, so it's not, but I mean, and also another thing to point out at McMaster, religious studies is in social sciences, not the humanities. And I think that our department just historically was less prone to a lot of the, cultural studies, postmodernist stuff at the time. But anyway, I just wanted to say that by way of introduction. I don't know if I should actually follow up on something that Matthias said, but I think it's true that you can identify the Iranian regime as authoritarian and horrible. And as a woman, I think it's appalling, but also for everybody. And what's happening with the young people in Iran and the courage they're showing and how little support they get outside of Iran, at least publicly. And then to say, but I think the war is wrong. Agreed. That's a position that's held. But I would defy anybody to find any person in the West who says, the Iranian regime's okay and the war's okay. I mean, I don't think that really happened. I mean, there are these moral judgments that come into all of these things. And I would also say that I would want to challenge the idea that if you hold that sex is binary, it's possible to do that. And I think most scientists, biologists, thinkers, feminists who hold that sex is binary are not transphobic just because they hold that position. It is perfectly possible, and I count myself in this group, with J.K. Rowling, the Steven Pinker, Richard Dawkins, as someone who thinks sex is binary, but that people who identify as transgender should have the same rights as everybody else. But you are not going to take away some of my rights as a woman or my granddaughter's rights as girls in order in order to prove that. I think that's ridiculous. And one of the things I'm most concerned about in Canada, because we seem to be way behind on this, and I'm sorry to go down this road, but it is men in women's prisons. Like, stop it. Stop it. Stop it. I know. Anyway, so that's that. All right. So now let me just.
Sorry, I know we're digressing. Can I add just one point? Freedom of information requests from feminist groups have shown that the men who request transfer to women's prisons, about half of them, if I remember correctly, are sex offenders.
Yeah.
Whereas only about, I think it's 18% of all male prisoners are sex offenders.
Yeah.
So this is very scary.
Heather Mason, who is leading the charge in Canada on this issue, was in a women's prison, and she is trying, and it's an uphill battle, but she's really working hard. She's developed an organization to try to, and I really admire her. I think this is something that needs to be done. Sports gets it all, the changing room at your local community center, but women in prison are some of the most vulnerable people. In California, in Canada, in the UK, in Scotland, where all this stuff has been going on. Anyway, but let me just now I should do what I've been told to do, which is just ask you about your paper. And the one, I'm going to quote you to you. Okay. So you said in your paper that the bottom line is this: it is never justified to distort the facts in the service of a social or political cause. Agreed. No matter how just. If the cause is truly just, then it can be defended in full acceptance of the facts about the real world. If that cannot be done, then the cause is not just. And I'm a little anxious about this because I think I'm a little bit nervous because it seems to me that right there you're conflating truth with what is just. Okay, can you speak to that?
Yeah, arguments about a particular policy will involve two things. You bring in facts about the way the world is, and that those facts should be true.
Right.
And then you bring to bear your own values, and you should state clearly what they are so that other people can see whether or not they share those values and use their own values instead if they want. And then you put those two things together and try to figure out which policy will better affect the things that you value, given what you know about the real world. So, for example, with climate change, right?
Right.
We need to know if you do X, then the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere will do Y, and the temperature will go up Z degrees, and so on, right? So that's purely scientific facts. Then there are value issues, which are much more complicated, right? How much do you value the people in Bangladesh who will, get flooded if the sea level rises 1 meter versus, people in rich countries that can protect themselves from that, and so on. That's all complicated. But you put those two things together, and then you have a debate about public policy. So if you can't defend your proposed policy on the basis of, what's really true about the real world, together with clearly stated values so that other people can debate those, then your cause, then you don't have any argument for your cause. That's just the point I'm making. So it's not that the truth determines the policy. It's the facts together with values. You reason from them to the policy.
Right.
If you can't reason to the policy from your values plus the real facts, if you have to distort the facts to justify your policy, then something's wrong. That's the point I'm trying to make.
You're right. And just one last point. I would just like to hear what you think about this. Why is the sex and gender issue the one that has, it seems to me, has changed our whole way of being in the world as human beings? Why has it been so powerful and has become so entrenched in public institutions and private corporations and so on?
I don't know. I mean, some of you are sociologists, right? I'm not. So that's, I mean, oh, sorry. That's an interesting question. I mean, maybe I've been affected by this by discussion with gender critical feminists in the UK. I mean, first at my university, Alice Sullivan and Judith Suissa, and then more generally. And then it also personally hit me because this is, again, a kind of extreme social constructivist or postmodernist view coming back 30 years later. I mean, there was one article that somebody wrote, I think maybe it was on the 25th anniversary of my parody article. The title was something like, Sokal won a battle but lost the war.
Oh, yeah.
And I increasingly believe that that's right. I mean, as I was saying, Bricmont and I were trying to argue that quarks are real, not socially constructed. And that was a little bit subtle for the reasons I said, right? Now we have to argue that, that biological sex is real, not assigned at birth. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned, so did I mention earlier? So last year, no, 2 years ago, Richard Dawkins and I wrote an article about the American Medical Association's dogma that sex is assigned at birth. We submitted it to the New York Times. It was rejected, right? The most famous biologist in the world co-authors an article on biology. The New York Times rejects it. We submitted it to the Washington Post, rejected. And now I have to say, 10 years ago, the New York Times would have been right to reject it because they could say, look, we don't publish op-ed articles arguing that the earth is round, right? But now they rejected it, I don't think for that reason. And finally, it was published in the Boston Globe. They had a courageous editor. But yeah, it's strange that it's coming up now. It's postmodernism really run amok, far beyond what we worried about 30 years ago. It's it's maybe not the most dangerous thing in the world today. I mean, women in Iran right now may be more worried about being bombed than about what bathroom transgender, because actually transgender is big in Iran because they'd rather that gay people change sex and become heterosexual. I mean, it's a little bit scary. But anyway, let's not go into that.
I'm done, Neil.
Okay, thank you so much. Len?
Yeah, I'll just carry on with
from
that point. I got 3 points.
Oh, here, sorry.
Let me just pick up the last thing you said, almost last thing. The real truth about the real world. I have no idea what that is. You talk about truth. What is truth? What are facts? Winston Churchill, I think, said, facts are just one goddamn thing after another. I don't understand. Maybe in mathematics, you know truth. In economics, we have no idea. In business school, we have no idea what truth or facts are. We'll investigate them. We're maybe, because I guess you could say we're not really scientists in the sense that physics and mathematics are, but even those have changed all the time. So I don't know what the facts are or what you say is truth. You talked about knowledge and detached factual knowledge and objective truth in your first statement. I don't know what an objective truth is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long philosophical discussion, but basically my definition of truth, I mean, and I'm talking about things about the real world. So I'm not talking about values. I'm not talking about aesthetic considerations, but factual questions about the real world. I don't know, what day was Shakespeare born? How many neutrinos per second are coming to the Earth from the sun? Right? I mean, so for me, truth is just another name for correspondence between a proposition and reality. Now, I understand that if these were philosophers in the audience, we would have an hour debate about that. But I mean, that's where I'm coming from philosophically. Bricmont and I wrote a chapter of our book about that, and trying to defend the kind of correspondence idea of truth, which is the, with the implicit philosophy of every scientist, I think. And I think you're too modest about economics, right? I mean, you do accumulate fact about things, what the interpretation of those facts are, what theories are compatible with those facts and what are not. That's complicated. And probably even in economics, at least, the accuracy of those facts is a problem because, of course, you're doing some kind of sampling and there's statistical errors, there's bias in definitions. And so, facts aren't simple, but basically it means looking at the real world and trying to figure out what is actually going on in the real world. I think it was Jim Brown, a philosopher of science here at the University of Toronto, who said, I don't remember the exact phrase, but it was something like, when philosophers or people claim to not know what facts are, it doesn't apply when they're crossing the street or when they're trying to figure out what kind of pizza to order. In everyday life, people seem to know what facts are.
Well, when I was at graduate school, our school was called Keynesian, and had a big fight with another school, which was a Chicago school. So the fighting the facts were the same, but their interpretation of them was so different. And that keeps going on, and in everything, in all kinds of so-called sciences. And so I understand, and I agree totally with your main point about scientific, that the knowledge we need cannot be constrained by not having a debate. I totally agree with that. And but I think the real problem is twofold. One is the lack of scientific rigor in many disciplines. And there's something just came today, which a year-long, this was in something called Semaphore. I don't know how many people read it every day. And it's a year-long project reviewing the results of social science studies found that barely half stood up to scrutiny. Since 2011, the replication crisis has devastated much of science, notably psychology. My wife is a psychologist. Hundreds of high-profile findings turned out to be a result of poor statistical practice and bad incentives. Doubt has been cast over the reality of famous discoveries. The latest research found that many papers failed to get enough information about their methods to replicate them, that of those that did, 49% failed to reach the statistical threshold for discovery. It's not only in psychology, it's in business schools. For example, a famous professor at Harvard was let go, fired, because critics found that her studies were made up. She didn't rely on facts. And so the lack of the statistical method, I think, is something that has to be brought into more into social sciences. And finally, I want to talk about the politicization of other things in universities. In Canada, we've had renaming of law schools because they were like, or at Queen's, the law school was a MacDonald Hall, the founder of Canada, but they had to rename the hall. So, and a politicization of faculty associations, student associations, that it's not about what they're learning, about what they're being taught, but what political events they do not like. And so how do we stop this politicization of the universities? Question.
I tend to agree. So there was a very good article by Steven Pinker, also in the Boston Globe, I think about a year and a half ago. So I think it was shortly after Trump's election and around the same time that Claudine Gay, the president of Harvard, was being outed for plagiarism. But so he basically was arguing the most important point was that universities should not take official positions on controversial issues unless those issues directly affect the operation of the university. The universities should be the forum where individuals can express, that is, professors and students can express their ideas and debate their ideas. The universities should not take official positions. So this was an idea that goes back to the Calvin Report at the University of Chicago in 1967. And a year later, so last year, Harvard had a committee and then adopted actually a very good neutrality position. It's worth reading. I think it's very good. And some other universities have done the same. The only sad thing is that this was done in part under pressure from the Trump administration when they should have done it years ago under pressure from moderate conservatives, moderate liberals, and even leftists, all of us who believe that, in academic freedom and in freedom of speech. It should have been done years ago. And it's unfortunate that it now looks like it's being done, as a result of Trump's threats.
So let me just add to that that's why Heterodox Academy exists. That's the point of the organization. Is the Chicago principle should be everywhere, and we should have open debate on these issues like we are today.
Yeah, I'd love to have more open debate in McMaster and maybe think about sort of institutional neutrality or institutional restraint. I mean, we don't have to be dogmatic about what that looks like, but I think it would be a really good thing to have those conversations. But thank you, Len, for putting that on.
Maybe a good place for me to jump in. I'm the humanist at the table, I guess. English department, teach poetry and poetics. Fascinated with the intersections between science and language. Relational thinking is really what I'm most interested in, and there's a vast amount of it in the sciences that I think is fascinating, and that we can learn from in the humanities. I maybe meant to be holding your feet to the fire as the humanist at the table, but I certainly wouldn't do it by defending any of the Kool-Aid drinking that you've been presenting in your talk, but maybe quite the opposite, and that is, well, first of all, as an English professor, I would tip my hat to you for such beautiful writing. And rhetorically nuanced. I can see what you're up to. And
I should say, people say, you write well for a physicist.
that's right.
I'm not sure whether that's a compliment or an insult.
Very good. Very savvy, because even when one does that, you're making rhetorical choices that are loaded in your favor. And most of the time when we're doing that kind of thing, we're not aware of it. So I guess I would do an historical thing with, the beautiful Hoax in the 90s and this paper today. And I don't see a lot of maturity, maturing, maturity there, but I don't see a maturing of your position over that time. What I would say is that we still are in a position between the left and the right, the sciences and the humanities, all of that's mixed together. You can't sort them in those terms. Both are pulling on the rope. There's a tug of war going on. There's a tug of war, and neither is going to let go. Right? The only way to stop a tug of war is to stop pulling. And the thing that was wrong, I found the hoax a hoot. It was a magnificent rhetorical achievement. And it was an offense to the sciences because you showed that you weren't listening to what was going on in the humanities and why the humanities was in the mess that it is in, right? We go back to John Stuart Mill and so on. He said, you've got to hear the other side. Even Mill gets it wrong, much as I love him, beautiful poetry critic. He gets it wrong and he said, you need the other side to oppose you in order to sharpen your own chops, right? That's the paragraph that you showed.
He says, among other things.
Among other things.
The first
yeah.
point is you need to listen to the other side. He says two things. First is you need to listen to the other side because they might be right.
Yes.
And you might want to change your mind.
Yes.
The second thing he says, I didn't quote it, but he also says that even if you're mostly right, you're probably not 100% right.
Mhm.
And you can improve your own ideas.
Yeah.
Even if you're 90% or 99% right, you can improve your own ideas by listening to the other side. And that's true even if the other side is 90% or 99% wrong.
Right.
You pick out what's right in their critique to
yeah.
improve yours.
Yeah.
That's
No, absolutely. Yeah. And that goes centrally to the question, the difficulty, even the impossibility of truly listening to the other side. There's one further step that he sort of leaves out in the passage, and in the talk, it's in a magnificent essay or a book on liberty, but he leaves out the challenge of articulating the other side in a way that after you do it, they stand up and come and hug you, right? And they say, thank you for that. Oh my God. And then you're only halfway through your talk. You get the hug from the other side and you say, here's why I disagree, right? It's the only way you'll get people to listen to you. When you perform a hoax, we saw it in the room, right? When we were looking at the passages online, we laughed, right? We laughed at them, right? The hoax was a magnificent hoot, but we were laughing at the humanities for being as stupid as it can be. Oh my God, can it be stupid, right? But when you're generating a parody of someone, you're not listening, right? You're saying you've got a problem there, and I'm gonna make a little joke here with these people, and we're gonna put you in your place, right? Rhetorically, again, as I say, it was a magnificent achievement. You found that language. What the difference is, they would not have said those things in those ways, right? I could go into a physics essay, sometimes I end up doing it, and I could pull out all kinds of language, and I could write what was a parody of physics, and you would get very annoyed with me, right? And you think, what are you doing with those words? Why are you using that language in that way? It's absurd to be doing so, right? And so we could go to all of those jargon-laden poor souls who are just adopting a language and feeling the confidence of, I wouldn't call it nonsense as you did, but the confidence of something complex that they're trying to get at, right? If a physicist spoke in very complex ways, we wouldn't go to a physicist and say, why can't you use ordinary words? Who do you think you are, physicist, talking about Lorentz curves and so on, right? Talk to me, right? But that's what you were doing with them. You were saying, why are you using these words that make no sense? Look at how I can use them to make fun of you, right? So that's one side. And I feel like if we don't change it on both sides, heterodox is doomed, because we will not be able to sustain the moderate middle, which is what we want. One thing that is we miss in the heterodox, in your discussion of it, is that the term dox is actually the Greek term for opinion, right? and so, you know, while we're saying you're critiquing opinion, as we would all do in the modern sense of the word, the term heterodox itself is saying, no, let's have lots of opinions. Not make fun of one another for having opinions. Let's have lots of opinions. So let's not force our language of truth upon the other side. The last thing that I would say about this is that over the years, I've watched my department and my faculty, breaks my heart, drift from its own calling because it's becoming so politicized. And I've come to recognize where that's coming from. And it's coming from a million things, but there's a cause and effect relationship for me of how literary studies has failed over the past 200 or 300 years, certainly the last 100, because it has felt marginalized in relation to a certain notion of what's true, right? Storytelling, ambiguities, spirit, all this language that we use in imaginative terms had a certain kind of dominant historical role up until it got its own power problems going, right through the churches breaking down, conflicting, and then the beautiful Enlightenment. The Enlightenment comes along and it has truth, right? And what does truth do? It says literature and the imagination is a beautiful thing, but we have to do this. We have to, and it's that hand that's going like that, and it's been doing it for 200 years, that pushes the humanities disciplines to try to be the real things with real results that the sciences is saying is the only thing that matters, right? The sciences is saying that's make-believe, that's myth, right? That's where the word took on the meaning that it did. That's myth. So that on the literary side, we have to come back and say, oh, no, we have all these real consequences, and then watch them twist and turn to try and show that there are genuine political, real world, historical, cultural, gender, race outcomes for literature. Look how much it matters. That's a response to a literalist approach to what truth is. And it's because the science is pulling in that direction, we have to respond, right? And it's a tragedy. We've lost our own center trying to do what the sciences has been saying we should be doing for hundreds of years. Be about something real. Well, they tried. Look at what mess that created, right? We're identifying those things. What's the solution? Somehow we have to stop pulling, or the experiment will be doomed. Was that enough of holding your feet to the fire?
Yeah, I mean, you raised a bunch of different things. So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by the metaphor of stopping pulling. I mean, I should say, if you want to go back to the hoax 30 years ago, I mean, it's important to remember the hoax was just the beginning. It was a public, if you want to say, it was a public relations stunt to start the discussion. Yeah. And then the actual our actual contribution to the discussion was the book that Bricmont and I wrote and subsequent articles, where we tried to analyze what people have written and criticize it. Yeah. And I hope fairly. So that's what one should look at, and not the parody article itself.
And my heart kind of breaks for you, because when you're in that kind of position doing that kind of work, it is next to impossible to articulate what it is that you're critiquing in a way that the other side would sign on to.
Well, you should try.
I know, absolutely.
The metaphor that you use, or the analogy that you used, I mean, was almost like what therapists say how couples should argue, right? Where you first restate
That's right.
what the other person has said
Yeah,
and get their agreement that you've accurately
Yes.
restated it,
Yes.
as you said, get a
Yeah.
hug
yeah,
before you then go on
Yeah,
to criticize
is.
it. And that could, I imagine, conceivably be, useful in political debate or academic debate
yeah.
if people would, would agree to a debate at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're right. It is important for the other person to agree that you've accurately stated what they believe
Yeah.
before you go on to criticize it. I don't know if I've ever had the possibility to, be in the same room with somebody and maybe, have the time to do it that way. I've never tried that, but I do try to accurately state, the view that I'm then going to criticize.
I'll give you an example. It is very astutely observed. It is a metaphor that I'm using, and metaphors are always right and wrong at the same time.
Yeah.
And the tug of war can get a certain amount of work done and distort the conversation, and you're straightening it out in important ways. I can give you an example of how one would stop pulling in the Maori story that you're telling. It partly goes to the question of how embattled are both sides, and are they both kind of overstating the case of what it would mean to include a little bit of, I think you said this yourself, a little bit of spiritual understanding. No, maybe it was a little bit of other ways of thinking of things into the science. Of course, we would all agree that it would be absurd to start teaching a science class by showing pictures of ancient mythological creatures, right? You're not going to get anything done in the sciences. Science cannot do that. However, one can show in both from a religious and a spiritual perspective that they are really in the same place so far as truth is concerned.
I'm sorry, who is in the same place?
The Maoris or anybody who was thinking of these questions in imaginative ways, religion, spirit, literature. I tend to box these things together for my sins. But then on the other side, truth, right? There's truth. So what one could do in the sciences is say, okay, over here we've got ambiguity, we've got imagination, we've got things, a bunch of things being true all at the same time. Physics has that as well. What physics wouldn't want to say at that point is that, for instance, in a singularity, a particle is a particle and a wave simultaneously, right? That's an absurdity, right? It's an absurdity. And the scientists, bless them, have struggled with that absurdity for 100 years. And you get people like Niels Bohr arguing with Einstein, or David Merman saying, shut up and calculate. Don't tell God what to do, says Niels Bohr. And they're going like this to the irrational aspect of the singularity. All they get in there is infinity, right? They can't make it fit. That's a problem. And they've been struggling to get it to fit for 100 years, right? Even while they go like this and saying our way is the best way. Oh, but here's this problem. We're just gonna do our science and move that over to the side. So moving towards the Maori people and saying, you know what? There is actually a thing that is very like the problem of God right at the core of the quantum, of the singularity. It is exactly the same problem. And we're on the same team trying to figure out what it means to have an imaginative way of thinking, an irrational way of thinking of things, and a rational way of thinking of things, right? And then you'd be moving towards them. And when you move towards someone, they can't pull anymore. It's actually impossible.
Well, I'm going to move towards them on that.
Yeah.
I don't think there is a link between the spiritual and the physical. I don't think that the spiritual, in the sense that we're discussing here, exists. And the physics, I mean, basically, I don't think you were describing accurately the story about quantum mechanics. I mean, the point is that physicists, honestly, we do not really understand what quantum mechanics is saying about the universe.
Yeah.
And it's not just a question of particles and waves. I mean, the serious physicists most physicists don't deal with the conceptual questions, because quantum mechanics gives accurate predictions about the world.
Yeah.
And for the most part, we don't have to struggle with the conceptual questions.
Yeah.
Those physicists who do struggle with the conceptual questions, and the philosophers of physics, the serious philosophers of physics who struggle with the conceptual questions, it's difficult. We really don't understand. There's a lot of debate among the physicists who work in that field. What is quantum mechanics telling us about the universe?
Mhm.
And it's possible, we don't really know, it's possible that this will be resolved only in the future when we get an accurate theory of quantum gravity, which may change all of the underlying conceptual things. We really don't know.
Yeah.
And I think so it doesn't make me more spiritual or more
Well,
religious.
in a way, I would say
I'm
that-
still an atheist materialist.
Yeah, but that's
But
a literal way of understanding what it means to be a spiritual person. I'm a materialist, and I love the quantum impasse, quantum general relativity impasse. I love it. I
don't love it. I want it to be solved.
But you see, that's the thing. It's when you come to it and you think there's something wrong in there that doesn't make sense. And we have to do the science, so we go like this. And there are a bunch of people on the other side who say that thing that you're saying is wrong and problematic is actually where everyone else who's on the other side of how the mind works, which is the imaginative side, that's where they live. There's the solution there, which would require a conceptual shift that could solve the thing that you don't understand. Right?
No, I don't. I
No,
mean,
you believe it because conceptually,
Can I
we've
have-
got
Can I just
we've
put
got
a
our
line in?
plans.
So why did Einstein at the end say there might be a God? All this order he saw, he couldn't explain it. And so maybe there is spirit and God.
I think he had a very metaphorical idea of what God is. He did not mean
You
God
see what
in
we
the
do
sense of
then?
the
Then we
traditional
say it's
religion.
metaphorical, we have to go like this. It doesn't count if it's metaphorical. But in the meantime, there's something going on at the heart of what metaphoric relation itself is saying, that it is both this and that, which is wave and particle. They are the same thing. We could all be on the same page. We don't have to be pulling apart.
Well, we got some disagreements here, so this is good.
This is
I
good.
think we should get some people in the.
Yes,
in the- so let's have
yeah, we've
Dean
been
and
talking
then
too
there.
much.
That was fantastic. Thank you, all of you. But
That's super interesting. Huge fan of yours. I remember I picked up your book at BMB right down the street before I was even an undergraduate student. And then I was sitting in Neil's class and he brought you up. And there was like 15 people sitting there and I was the only one that knew who you were. And I think it really like impressed Neil. But I really appreciate I appreciated everything that you said. I have a clarificatory question, and then I have sort of a substantive question. When you talked about the Sally Boxendale piece about sort of like puberty blockers and cognition, was that rejected because of the Nature policy that you were talking about, or you were just sort of?
No, it wasn't Nature. It was different journals. I don't remember the details. But she wrote a brief article about it in the British online journal Unheard. So if you look on Unheard, at least if you can get beyond the paywall, I think you can read her article in Unheard, where she tells the story of what the different journals did rejecting her paper.
Okay, that is great to know.
It was not Nature.
And so thinking about the nature policy, I wonder if there are ways in which actually scientific ideas can get in the way of facts, right? And I'm thinking specifically of the issue of race, right? And one of the things that the nature policy outlines is the idea that race shouldn't be a proxy for other variables. Specifically, in that document that you showed up there, they say that race shouldn't be seen as a proxy for income, right? That's one of the things that they're making. And often a lot of the research that has been done over time, right, has often treated race as independent from income and then made sort of biological inferences about racial groups that were actually sort of sociological inferences that were based on income. And so my question is, right, are there ways in which our understanding of scientific knowledge, like about things like race, right, interfere with factual knowledge? And is there a way in which a policy like Nature's can actually be purifying and actually create better science and better factual information? And then sort of just because I want to know it, is there any sort of redeeming element of postmodernism that you see, right? And I would say this very seriously, right? Like ideologies are the story we tell ourselves about the way that the world works. And in my experience, I want many stories, right? Because I know that no story can be perfect all of the time. And I wonder, like, is there anything in postmodernism that you see having value that is sort of purifying or clarifying for your own vision or your own understanding of the world?
Yeah, so let me talk about your first question first. So I absolutely agree that, I mean, I'm not a social scientist, but I absolutely agree in any science, social or natural, you should look at all of the relevant variables. And if you're looking at one variable that's correlated with another that you're not observing, then that's a real problem. So for example, during COVID, it was clear that the mortality rates were much higher in certain racial groups than in others. But I would bet, and I don't know whether people have actually gotten this information, that a large part of that had to do with what occupations people were working in, had to do with how crowded their households were, and was not specifically about their race, but of course, all of those things correlated with race. And so absolutely, all those things should be disambiguated, and it's really a bad idea to use race, geographical ancestry as a proxy for other things. Absolutely, because one has to try to figure out what are the true relevant variables and not think it's X when it's really Y, but Y happens to be correlated with X. So absolutely, I totally agree. As far as postmodernism, I mean, of course, it's such a broad thing, and there are all sorts of different views. So maybe it would be better to say, to give the analogous answer, although it's similar, about social constructivism in sociology. I mean, a moderate social constructivism in the sociology of science makes perfect sense, right? The idea that which false things scientists come to believe at certain times is in part related to social prejudices and all sorts of stuff. And also which true things get discovered and which don't is also related to social prejudices, well, to economic things also, to a lot. So all of that is sensible, right? It's only when you start thinking that scientists' beliefs are solely the result of social prejudices or social effects, and not also influenced by observation of nature. That's the extreme social constructivism that Bricmont and I were protesting against 30 years ago. And I didn't bring the quote. Well, I have in my bag the quotes from the prominent sociologists of science who were saying things like the natural world plays little or no role in the construction of scientists' belief about nature. I mean, that's just crazy. But that social things also play some role, that's a truism. And a sensible sociology of science tries to investigate both sides of the, both types of causes of scientist belief. So, the same with postmodernism. I mean, postmodernism was criticizing, what's the word? Meta-narratives, totalizing views of the world. And that's fair to criticize because a lot of the totalizing views of the world, a lot of the ideologies were partly false, right? I mean, they were trying to make a complicated world too simple, right? And I mean I personally would say that Marx was right about a lot of things about how economics affects history, but history is not just the effect of economics, right? So people were right to criticize ideologies that had too simple a view of the world, but you didn't need postmodernism for that. I mean, anybody could have rightly made that critique. So I guess that's what I would say.
Okay, I think Andy's just gonna have somebody from the live stream, and then we'll get to you. So we'll just go back and forth. Okay, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So this is a question from Tim. So how do you distinguish between the internal threats that undermine scientific norms, which, basically was your talk, between that and sort of serious calls for reform, so critiques that expose kind of real institutional weaknesses, I guess, in science. So a bit like how figures like Martin Luther were once seen as threats, but are now understood to have identified genuine institutional corruption. Might there be genuine instances of corruption in contemporary science?
Sure. I mean, absolutely. I mean, well, there's corruption. I mean, in some cases, fraud. I mean, in some extreme cases, fraud. In a much larger number of cases, especially in the social sciences, but not entirely. I mean, one of you was saying, I forget who it was who was pointing out that large numbers of studies just don't replicate, right? I mean, absolutely right. So all of these things should be criticized and discussed, right? I mean, we want to improve science. The way science is organized is definitely not perfect, and we want to improve it. But we want to improve it by discussing what the problems are and trying to figure out how to solve those problems in order to find more accurately and more objectively the truths about the world that science is trying to find, and not by imposing ideological constraints on what science is allowed to or not allowed to find. And that's true, I stress, whether the ideology comes from the so-called left or from the right. I mean, you look at the Trump administration's one of the executive orders in the first few days was about the teaching of American history in the public schools, and it begins by denouncing ideological teaching of history from the left, and says, we've got to get back to teaching truthfully, and then says, and we have to present a view of American history that shows it as heroic and favorable and blah, blah, blah. I mean, so all they're trying to do is impose a different ideology, and totally oblivious to the fact that teaching the truths of American history might not show that everything was all that heroic, right? And so I'm just saying, look, teach the truth, and debate the truth too, right? Because of course in history there are lots of debates about, first of all, about what actually happened, but secondly about how you interpret it. And so debate that. And then finally, I mean, maybe this is not exactly what we were discussing, but it's relevant with the debate about things like critical race theory, there's a brilliant article by Helen Pluckrose, who's actually a personal friend of mine in London, a few years ago in Ario magazine. No, it wasn't in Ario, but anyway, you can find it on the internet if you do Helen Pluckrose critical race theory. And she points out that a lot of the Republican state legislators' bills about banning critical race theory fail to distinguish between two things: teaching about and indoctrinating in. They throw those together. And she says, consider the teaching of religion, right? How should we teach religion in the public schools? We should teach about all religions. We should not indoctrinate in any religion. And she says critical race theory should be treated in exactly the same way. We should teach about critical race theory. We should also teach opposing theories about opposing ways of interpreting the same history. We should debate those things. We should not indoctrinate in any of those, neither critical race theory nor Trump's ideas.
Somebody here? Yes, go ahead.
I really enjoyed your talk, but there's one argument that you could have made but didn't. It's a wrinkle in epistemology that's rather curious, and for some reason it seems obvious but isn't. A theory is a simplification so people can understand what's going on. A model is a kind of theory. It's obviously a simplification. Now, if it's a simplification, then everything that the theory explains everything that the theory does not explain is not explained. It's there. So if you try to model an airplane, you can't model just the outside. If you want to understand the plane, you have to model the inside and the engines and the hydraulic systems as well. So if the most efficient models or theories the minimum and most efficient would be two that are mutually exclusive. So the inside, the outside would be more efficient than trying to combine them and more complete. So when you this fits very well with physics. I mean, the Newtonian physics is one model, and quantum physics is another. They model opposite stuff. One models what the other doesn't. There's no reason to expect one to be explicable in terms of the other.
Well, I would take a different point of view. There's one universe, and physics aims to find true theories that describe the universe as it is. All the theories we have at present are just approximate theories. We know they're not exactly right. Newtonian physics was an approximate theory, which then had to be revised by special relativity and general relativity. Quantum mechanics is a very conceptually different theory that has the Newtonian, that includes inside it Newtonian physics as a limiting case. So it's not that they're radically different theories. It's that quantum mechanics includes what was already known from Newtonian physics. The problem being, however, that we don't really understand what quantum mechanics is saying. So the whole thing is very complicated because we don't really understand the conceptual nature of quantum mechanics. But our goal is to find a theory of everything. But that probably won't be done in my lifetime. I don't know if it will ever be done.
But if a theory is a simplification, it cannot be of everything.
Right. Well, right. The goal of physics ideally would to find the exact theory of everything. As I said, that we're nowhere near that right now. Yeah.
But I want to push back on that. So sure, Newtonian mechanics is an approximation before the phenomenon that Newtonian mechanics explains, it's not a simplification, right? It is explaining all of that level of macroscopic phenomena from, very small things to stars, right? So it's not leaving out anything, right? It's just leaving out the stuff where it fails, and then it fails at the quantum mechanical level. But it's not like you need Newtonian mechanics, and then you need something else, and then you need something else, and something else. For example, to explain an airplane, you just need Newtonian mechanics, right? You don't need anything else.
But it is a simplification in the sense that you turn it into one thing. Right? You're saying it, all of these many details, if we get them to fit together, will become a singularity, a unity, and that unity will be a simplification other than, it will be different than all of its parts inside it. That's the singularity multiplicity puzzle, right? So it is both an infinite complexity and a simplification at the same time.
But then I just want to say a joke, and going back to Len and economics, that so there's a well-known condition called physics envy that most and Andrew Lo, famous economist at MIT, explained physics envy by saying that in physics there are 3 laws that explain 98% of the observed phenomena, and in economics they have 98 laws that explain 3% of the observed phenomena.
That's right. Okay, we have another question from the live stream, Andy.
Yeah, this is from Athena, and I guess it relates to kind of indigenous knowledge, so ancient ecological wisdom, of indigenous communities is kind of based on a sort of scientific observation of nature, and that gets wrapped up in storytelling. So isn't there some place for storytelling of indigenous peoples amongst science?
So I would answer, in science, the important thing is not storytelling. The important thing is what what facts you've observed about the world. Now, it's certainly true that indigenous peoples have lots of knowledge, scientific knowledge, especially about the ecology of their local areas, and that whenever it's accurate should be incorporated into modern science. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Once you start bringing in the spiritual, then I'll say no, that's not part of science. But it's absolutely true that, I mean, every people in the world have tried, in every moment of history, have tried to observe the world, have made observations about the world, and most people know more about their local ecology. Well, I don't, but people, people who have lived on the land know more about their local ecology than many scientists. So absolutely, that knowledge should be incorporated.
But you could push back on that with science not being about story by recognizing that there is a relationship between theory and story. The actual root of the word theory comes from theater. It's a performance. It's a thing that you try and get to hold together. Story is exactly the same thing. This story is not a story until it goes like this, right? And that's what a theory or a model is. It's trying to go like this. And so again, I would feel like science and religion are really trying to do the same thing. They're just using different language about what the rules are, and they can't stop pulling on whose rules are better.
Well, I'm not in favor of a reconciliation between science and religion.
Yeah.
Okay. Dean, you have a comment, and then Harry, and then.
Yeah, just to maybe think through this idea. Like, I think that what basically people are saying is that, like, our mind is finite, but the universe around us is infinite, right? And so our mind always has to pixelate reality in order to compress what is infinite into something finite. And in that way, models that we have will never perfectly map onto the universe. There's always going to be a discontinuity between those two things, right? I think that maybe you're pixelating reality incorrectly when it comes to indigeneity and spirituality. And I think that what you're doing is you're applying an idea, a Western-centric sort of notion of spirituality that comes from Judeo-Christian religions to indigenous peoples and indigenous languages. And I guarantee you that your conception of spirituality is not accurately reflecting what Maori people mean when they say spirituality. And like, I don't know everything about this, but I know a little bit about it. And for Maori people, like when they use the concept of spirituality, what they mean is the things that can't be like explained through observation, right? So like the problem that is left over when observation can't explain perfectly what we encounter, what we experience, right? And I think in that way, their concept of spirituality actually maps on to a lot of the things that you're saying, right? And that maybe there's a bias that is obstructing your ability to appreciate and understand their knowledges, right? And I think that a lot of indigenous people around the world have ideas that maybe when we laminate or we sort of impose our Western-centric notion of what something is onto it, of course it seems ludicrous. Of course it seems unscientific, right? But if you actually sit down with an elder for long enough and begin to appreciate and understand what they're saying, you might have a richer understanding of the world that actually makes your facts and your sciences even stronger.
Yeah, I'll certainly accept. I mean, I think that's a good point, that I may be misunderstanding what Maori mean by spirituality. The word maybe is taking on the Western meaning. So, okay, so then we should try to understand what they're talking about. I mean, if it's just, if they're just saying things you don't now understand and trying to point out that you don't understand everything, then, you know, that's fair enough. So we'll have to see what is actually meant by it. It's not clear to me that the New Zealand chemistry curriculum for high school students is bothering to do that, right? I mean, they're just putting in these words. And in fact, I don't think they even explained what Maori is. I mean, the definition that I use, the binding force between the physical and the spiritual, comes from a dictionary of Maori knowledge that was cited by this New Zealand chemist. So I don't even know whether the New Zealand curriculum even bothers to explain that. I mean, it strikes me as what's the word? Performative is not exactly the right word, but what?
Virtue signaling?
Yeah, but not just virtue. Yeah, that, and you know, a very superficial throwing Maori knowledge into the chemistry curriculum without really addressing what the Maoris are trying to say either. And certainly is not helping to enhance high school students' knowledge of chemistry.
I think that's perfect. I think there's this lovely reciprocity here, and it makes the point that your fellow who was speaking after, okay, if there is this thing that's going on, then we need to know about it, right? Where is this thing? Well, let's listen. If it's there, we really do want to know about it, right? And it's that generosity of spirit that you're naming that could lead to that.
Right. Of course, he intended it in a skeptical way, right? I mean, it was rhetorical. He was saying, "Well, you know,
I know.
Let's see the evidence." Right.
That's a little bit of the tongue-in-cheek condescension that doesn't really then get us anywhere, right? Because he's just pretending it's not going to be there, right? Whereas the allowance that you're making and that we're hearing about would go in the other direction. Okay, let us listen and see what's there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm skeptical about whether in the Maori tradition there's anything that will enhance the teaching of chemistry.
Well,
right?
yeah,
I'm not skeptical about whether there's something that might enhance the tradition of the ecology of plants in New Zealand, right? Two different sciences that, but yeah, I mean, I just say, okay, let's look at the evidence.
Yeah, I think just to add on, I'm the resident chemist here.
think there's a great example of ethnobotany, medicinal chemistry, and indigenous use of medicines.
Yeah.
That's fully appropriate in a chemistry curriculum. I think what you're citing is probably an inappropriate option that's kind of forced and just like cringy, I think, in some sense. So I don't deny there are ways you can integrate it. I think it has to be done judicially and with appropriateness, that's all. So whether it's a Chachona tree and the first, as isolation of quinine for the first antimalarial, there's plenty of examples of that where that'd be appropriate. What else? I also wanted to maybe counterpoint as well with scientific papers, because I'm a analytical chemist. We develop quantitative methods for chemical analysis, and I teach undergraduate course. I do a lot of fraud exposés in scientific literature. So I try and get my students to think critically and be skeptical with the data that's presented, because I would argue that many scientific papers are narrative driven. They should be based on data and evidence, but often I ask the students not to be swayed by the abstract, which often, or the title that leads to perhaps inflated sort of interpretations of the data, but go to the actual data itself and see whether that matches the narrative, because narratives often is storytelling. That you need to be very careful whether that balances. So I find that the scientific paper is usually portrayed like it's a deconstruction, it's a reconstruction of how things really happened to make it logical and linear, but it doesn't reflect how things were discovered or identified. So it's just an accepted norm of sorts of how to present the data in a way that it's comprehensible to, say, a reader who's not unfamiliar with that type of research. So I do agree there's a lot of crossover in terms of the humanities, because, the greatest scientists, if they cannot communicate their ideas, no one will appreciate it. So communication, storytelling, in many ways does play, I think, a pivotal role in scientific research and communication, especially. Just wanted to add those comments.
And did you have another one up from the live stream, or?
Yeah. So this is from Francesco, and sort of maybe changing tact a little bit. So does Professor Sokal agree with the idea that intolerance and censoriousness among progressives have played a role in fueling the rise of the hard right? And then, if so, how can we get progressives to take accountability for their counterproductive behavior without engaging in a new form of finger pointing and cancel culture?
Yes, I do agree. And that was one of the things that I alluded to at the beginning when I said that these two attacks on science and on academic freedom are not unrelated. And so I'm just going to throw out some half-baked ideas that I hope we'll discuss more. But I think they're not unrelated precisely in the way that you're alluding to. Namely, first of all, in the universities, there's increasingly an ideological monoculture. I mean, it's in the United States, it's long been established that the liberals and Democrats are dominant over conservatives and Republicans. I mean, in science departments, only 4-1. In English departments, 10-1. In some departments, infinity to 1. I wish that, by the way, I should say, I wish those studies were redone now with a more multidimensional sense of politics than just left to right, because within the left, I mean, I would describe myself on the fairly far but not extremely far left, in the old sense of the left, right, about social class and economics, and moderate in some of the other left things, and definitely not woke. But so they're on the left, and then on the right you have honest conservatives, you have MAGA authoritarians, you have libertarians, and all of this. I wish that these things were redone now. But anyway, there's clearly not as much viewpoint diversity in the universities as there ought to be. There clearly is ideology masquerading as scholarship in some areas of the university. Not everything in those areas, but some things in those areas. And ordinary people can see that, right? And they can see that ideas that they think are right are being censored in the universities. And so that obviously decreases the esteem that ordinary people, or at least some ordinary people, have for the universities and for the universities' ability to project, to produce objective knowledge. And that leads a significant fraction of the population to vote, first of all, to vote for Trump. I mean, I think it's one cause among many, 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 but I think it's not an insignificant one of the causes. And secondly, it leads a significant fraction of the population to approve Trump's attacks on the universities and on academic freedom. And so, you know, I wish that the universities had listened to people like Steven Pinker 5 years ago, and I wish we had cleaned our own house 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and we didn't. And I don't say we deserved what we got. We didn't, but it was maybe predictable. It came out even worse than I would have feared. I mean, if you look at my book from 2008, or a talk I gave in 2008, and the way I talk about how the administration of George Bush, you know, falsified the evidence about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and all that. I mean, I thought George Bush was bad.
Yeah.
Now I want him back. But so maybe sociologists have done this, and I just haven't followed the literature, trying to understand who voted for Trump and why. But I really do want to understand. So, for example, the ad, Kamala Harris is for they, them, President Trump is for you. Right? I mean, that's clever in two ways. First of all, they, them is an allusion to the transgender debates, but also they, them, the liberal elites, right? I mean, that is probably one of the most brilliant political ads in the last century. And I read a comment of a left-wing gender-critical feminist who said, when I heard that ad, I fell off my chair and I knew that the election was lost right then. That ad may have swayed 2% of the vote. But that's enough, exactly. And so again, some sociologists or political scientists should try to find out by surveys how many people were swayed by that ad. But I would guess a few percent.
So Harry, and then woman in the green, and then we'll go up to the live stream, and I guess we're getting a little bit
Anyway,
of time.
I wanted to thank Neil and Phil and Len for organizing this. Has been really fantastic. So my question comes from something where you discussed also, Matthias, the idea of using values and judgment coupled with science. So it seems to me that during this, during COVID, perhaps leaders may have appealed too much to science instead of actually using it as well as their own values and being honest about those. And that can sometimes lead to maybe something you might call like a scientism, where science provides us with the values. Like I think you said ought, the is doesn't give you an ought. Maybe that's, you alluded to that, I don't know who said that, Hume Bacon or someone. And the alignment, the Scottish alignment, someone who said that. So I wonder if you could talk about the danger of scientism, and maybe that has led to a backlash. I think you even discussed this in one of your books, pseudoscience, mixing with postmodernism, leading to strange things. And maybe this can help predict things like we see with the vaccine hesitancy, and now we have blowups of measles in Texas, or even Waterloo in Ontario, all kinds of places which we wouldn't have had even 10 years before. It seems like there's a reaction to the scientism, and maybe you could talk about how as scientists, we could avoid falling into that trap.
The slogan, follow the science, I think that for me was always very.
Yeah, that was dangerous. Yeah, that was dangerous because politicians who used that were using science as a cover for things that, as you say, involve not just science, but value judgments. And that I mean, to be straight about it, that's misleading the public, right? Each member of the public has a right to analyze and evaluate proposed policies based on using what should be a set of agreed facts, but then applying their own values. And people's values may differ, and that's why people may come to different judgments about policies, even when we agree on the facts. I mean, what's sad now is nowadays we're having trouble. Everybody not only has their own values, but their own facts. And that's a real problem, right? But I absolutely agree that we mustn't use science as an excuse to cover up the value issue and to try to try to hide the values that I'm using so that other people can't evaluate them based on their values, which might be different from mine. That is definitely a misuse. And scientists have to be careful about this too, right? Scientists have to be very, very clear when they're speaking as scientists, speaking about the scientific facts, and when they're putting on a different hat and speaking as concerned citizens who say, okay, now given the facts, I believe that we should do such and such policy rather than such and such else based on my values, right? It's really important to separate those two roles. There's the Association Française pour l'Information Scientifique, AFIS, has a good explanation of that. So they have a journal where they, bring in scientists to explain the current state of science on various issues that impact public policy. And they're very clear that science informs public policy. It does not determine public policy.
And Len has a comment on that, and then we'll go to you.
Yeah, but when you kind of dismiss spirituality because I don't see the facts of it, that's a bad scientific way of doing it. I find scientists like physicists, mathematicians, not necessarily economists, dismissing these things out of hand. I'm an atheist. I don't see spirituality. You dismiss everything because you don't see scientific basis for it. And I think that's absolutely wrong to do.
Person in green, yeah, go ahead.
Hey, mic here for you.
This discussion is a good segue to the point I wanted to make. I'm a scientist, I'm a psychologist, so maybe not everybody thinks I'm a real scientist. You keep talking about scientific facts. That's really a misnomer. There are no scientific facts. There's scientific evidence from which we make inferences, and we hope that we get a lot of converging evidence so that we become more confident about the inferences we make. And it seems to me that using that language of scientific facts obscures the debate in a way, because it indicates a kind of certainty that scientists don't really have. The public doesn't understand that scientists are not proving things unless they're mathematicians. Mathematicians can do proofs, while all the rest of us are just collecting evidence to support hypotheses or sometimes not support our hypotheses. And the public doesn't understand that either, which means that when new evidence comes out that contradicts the previous evidence, they think the facts have been shut down and lose trust in science. So I think it's very unfortunate language to talk about scientific facts.
That's a very good point. I may have been sloppy about my language. I have to reread what I wrote. When I refer to facts, what I mean is the state of the world, the way the world really is. And you're right, of course, scientists don't observe the facts directly. We obtain evidence about the state of the world, and that evidence is incomplete, and possibly we've misunderstood it. So that's absolutely right, and so that's a good point, and we should do a better job of explaining to the public that what we have is an incomplete and revisable understanding of the way the world is, and we're trying our best to get an objective understanding of the way of the parts of the world that we're investigating, but it's in principle, it's provisional. That's absolutely right.
Yeah, a little less pulling on the rope there. I like that, so.
Yes, you want something like Wittgenstein's language, right? What is the case? Something is the case, right? And that's what physics and science reaches towards, because it believes that something must be the case, because here we are. But the question of what a fact is that's just where physics in a way does its best work, because it won't let a fact be a fact until it's in relation to a model. The model will be indeterminate if all the facts don't fit. And that relationship between what gets to be a fact and it gets to be a fact only when the things fit together. They'll only fit together if you can get all the facts to align, and it never ends, right? It's that relation. But we use different terms for, this is a singularity and it's a fact, right? And all by itself, it's a fact, but it's impossible.
Andy, you got another one? We have someone else here, but maybe from the live stream first.
Yeah, maybe one last one from the live stream. This is a general question. So what practices can help academics protect rigor and free inquiry when external social or political pressures risk distorting how evidence is evaluated?
That's a good question. Maybe no, but maybe all of us should try to think about that. How do you resist pressure to distort, what you're doing? I mean, it's easy enough. I have tenure. It's much harder if you don't.
Just a scientific Hippocratic oath of sorts. To hold true to truth despite being swayed, do no harm, essentially, equivalent of that from a medical standpoint.
That's not a bad. I mean, it's not a bad idea that maybe scientists should have a little bit more philosophical and ethical discussion in their training than they do now.
There's too much, I guess, evidence of selective recording, confirmation bias, poor study designs, and the Rufus politicization that's mentioned here. We need a serious rethink on how to educate the next generation of scientists, for sure.
It's even worse. Doctors together today having to have hypocrites.
You got one? You got a question here? You have a.
What did you say? The hypocritical oath?
I just want to thank everybody. I've really found great value in everybody's opinions here, and from the questions from the audience to the speaker to the panel here. Especially being a writer myself, the humanist side of the kind of that pull of the conversation, and the I don't know, just you talked about finding that middle ground, right? It's important that I believe it was you that mentioned finding that middle ground and making sure that that's what we embrace here, because we do get the extreme left and the extreme right, and at the end of the day, a heterodox is supposed to be about coming together in the middle, and still maybe walking away with our own opinions, but being open-minded to what we've heard in the conversation. You talk about CRT, and I come from a more public education, 3 teenage kids who've been through this kind of nightmare of the last, 8 years or so. I guess it's probably a bit of a chicken and the egg, because these universities are teaching the teachers that are teaching our children and bringing their own kind of ideologies and beliefs into this question.
why haven't, we've got some great minds like Irshad Manji or Chloe Baldry who've talked about having these kind of discussions about debate and being open-minded and moral courage and all that stuff. But if you look at our policies and our programs in our public education systems, they are so just wrought with the CRT ideologies. When you said that we should be teaching them both, we shouldn't be teaching them about one religion. We should be teaching them about religion in general. So, why has there been that push against bringing that kind of that balance in and not being so blatant that our curriculum is CRT based? It's that one-sided when I want my kids to debate all the opinions. So what do you feel is it the universities that has pushed that? Can change in public education so that our kids aren't getting to the point where they've got to university that they're so entrenched in these ideologies that this is just now what they expect at university. Like I said, maybe chicken and the egg, but how do we find that balance in both of those realms? Because now my kids are all getting ready to go to university and we're all kind of like, oh my God, like, can we all just go to Peterson Academy or something and avoid the ideologies and just focus on, just facts and keep the opinions to at least expressing that they're opinions, right? So that's the worry that parents are facing, and what's the solution?
Maybe we could organize an event and kind of like go into that at some time, and we could talk about that. And so, I don't know, it's kind of getting a little bit late, but I mean, I just have one little comment. I got to take the chair. Like, I think you did the right thing. What you did is an amazing thing, that hoax. And I love what Helen Proclose is doing. And I think there's sort of things, but I do think there are some people who follow that up, which you're not responsible for, like Peter Bergosi and James Lindsay, who are really pulling the rope really heavy on the other side, who are mocking people, calling everybody communists, explaining things. It's all postmodern neo-Marxism. There's a kind of rhetoric that's going on. And I kind of get why people might feel that way. It feels like that, but I think it's kind of very destructive. You're not responsible for that. But anyway, maybe we could organize some follow-up meetings and have those conversations. And we also have Stanley Fish, who's on the other side of the Sokal hoax on April 24th. We're going to have a live stream with him. We have a couple of faculty who are kind of, Jeffrey's going to be there, and some philosopher. And so, but anyway, I think it's getting late. So I really wanted to thank everybody for being on the panel. This is an amazing, I thought that was really, really constructive and kind of cool. And you got your criticisms that you were looking for. And
Yeah, good. It was good.
And
Thank you.
And thank you for coming, Alan. And it's really good to see you again. And thank you for. Very good. I think it worked out well. Yeah. Thank you for everything. I didn't. Yeah. So
This is great fun.
yeah, I think it's kind of like that's what this is all about. Eh? Really, we don't do much about it. We don't do much.
Okay, thanks, Neil. I'm going to sign off now.
Thank you. I know it's late. I'll put in the hour that I'll begin more.
Oh, no worries at all.